Della Hartwell pushed open the door to room 7 with her elbow, both hands still gripping the night's tray of medicine. She knew this was the last time she would ever be allowed inside by morning. They would throw her out of the mansion for a crime she had never committed. So she pulled a chair close to the bed of the most powerful man in the city, the man who had lain motionless since the night he was brought home, not to share her usual stories, but to say a final, heartbreaking goodbye. She told him everything. How she had been falsely accused of stealing. How frightened she truly was. How she kept forcing herself through each day for the little brother waiting for her at home. And then, as she did every night, she softly hummed the song her mother had left her, before passing away, a song she sang for a man she was certain would never hear it. But Della was wrong. Wesley Calderon had woken 6 nights ago. He had heard every word she spoke, every note she hummed, and right now, as she leaned down to bid him farewell, he had just quietly made a decision that would change the course of her entire life. She was not going anywhere. If Della's story touched your heart, please leave a like, so we'll know you're still listening. Don't forget to share this video with those who need a warm story today. And please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next deeply emotional stories. When the door to room number 7 closed behind her, Della stood still for a moment in the long, seemingly endless corridor, where the wall lamps cast a sickly yellow glow that stretched her shadow across the cold marble floor. The Calderon mansion at midnight was so quiet that she could hear the beat of her own heart. She clutched the empty tray tightly to her chest and walked as softly as she could toward the servants' staircase, that narrow, dark stairway hidden behind the kitchen, the one only people like her were allowed to use. Each familiar step beneath her feet felt strangely heavy tonight, because she knew this might be one of the last times she would ever walk down them. Della Hartwell had only been working as a maid in this place for 4 months, but those 4 months had been enough for her to understand the harsh order that existed beneath the mansion's splendor. She belonged to the youngest group of servants, was assigned the shifts no one else wanted, and the night shift caring for the man lying motionless in room number 7 was among the hardest of all. The maids took turns watching over him according to a schedule the housekeeper had arranged with her own hands, one woman following another through the day and night, without pause. During the day, 2 or 3 of them rotated in and out, but at night, when the entire mansion sank into sleep, Della was almost always the only one left sitting beside that bed. Della didn't complain. The night shift paid a little extra, and she needed every single cent. The work of the maids assigned to the room wasn't complicated, only cleaning, changing towels, recording the patient's breathing in the notebook placed at the head of the bed, and most importantly, bringing up the medicine tray at the proper hour. Every evening, one of the women in the group would go down to receive the tray from the dispensary in the basement, where the medications had already been prepared and covered, then carry it up to room number 7, according to the fixed schedule. It had become such a routine that Della no longer had to think about it. When the hour came, she went down to collect the tray, carried it up, and set it in its proper place. She'd never once wondered who prepared those doses of medicine, and she'd never suspected that this small, ordinary, repeated task would one day become something that haunted her to the marrow of her bones. When she reached the servants' quarters, Della set the tray back in its place and sank heavily onto the rickety wooden chair in the corner of the common room. Her hands were calloused, the tips of her fingers cracked from washing water and soap, and they trembled beyond her control. She still hadn't recovered from what had happened that afternoon. Mrs. Marlene Vosberg, the head housekeeper of the mansion, a woman whose voice was as sharp as a shard of glass, had summoned her coldly into the private office, cornering her with a false accusation and announcing that by morning she would have to pack her things and leave. The reason, the woman said, was that a treasured piece of jewelry belonging to an honored guest had disappeared, and all the evidence pointed to Della. She had tried to explain. She had said that she'd never once set foot in the room where the item had gone missing, that she knew nothing about it at all. But what weight could the words of a poor maid who had only just started working there carry against the words of a housekeeper who had served this family for many years? Mrs. Marlene had only looked at her with cold eyes mixed with a strange hint of satisfaction, then waved her hand to dismiss her. The decision had been made. There was no trial for people like her. Sitting in the silent common room, Della looked up at the stained ceiling and tried to swallow the lump rising in her throat. She thought about this month's wages, which she might never be paid, thought about the debt still left unfinished, and thought about her little brother waiting for her in the rented room across the city. Her tears had run dry since afternoon, and now there was only an empty, hollow exhaustion left inside her. It was in that moment, as she looked toward the staircase leading up to room number 7, that a strange thought suddenly came to her. If she had to leave in the morning, then at least tonight, she wanted to say goodbye to the only person in this place who had never judged her with a single word. Della's habit of sitting and telling stories to someone who couldn't answer her had not come from nowhere. It began on a night nearly 2 years earlier, the night she never allowed herself to forget. Her mother passed away in a cramped hospital room on the edge of the city, close to daybreak, when Della had only just closed her eyes for a few minutes after many sleepless days. She woke and realized that the hand she had been holding had gone cold without her knowing when, that the woman who had given birth to her, who had raised her on every carefully saved dollar from cleaning jobs, had left this world alone in silence, without a word of farewell, without anyone beside her to hear her final sentence. That feeling of guilt and sorrow clung to Della through the months that followed, and from then on, she made herself one simple promise, one she held in her heart like the most sacred oath of all, that she would never let anyone lie there in silence again, never let anyone be alone in the hours when they might believe the whole world had turned its back. That was why, from the very first night, she was assigned to watch room number 7. When she looked at the unfamiliar man, lying motionless on the bed with his pale face and fragile breathing, Della didn't see a frightening, powerful master. She saw only a human being drifting somewhere along the border of life, perhaps even lonelier than she was. And so she began talking to him. Every night, after her work was done, she would pull a chair close and sit down, telling him all sorts of things, about how the older servants made her take on the heaviest tasks, about how she saved every cent to send back to her younger brother, about the old days when she and her mother had still been whole together. She spoke to him the way she might speak to an old friend, without hiding anything, without dressing her words up, because she was certain he couldn't hear her, and that very belief made her feel strangely lighter, as though she were pouring her burdens into a deep, bottomless well without fear of being judged. Della had another small habit she'd never told anyone about. Each night, she brought with her a pebble she had picked up somewhere during the day, sometimes from a corner of the courtyard, sometimes from the stone path leading out to the gate, and she placed it on the little table beside his bed as a way of marking that she had made it through one more day without collapsing. To her, each pebble was a day survived, a day she had forced herself to stand again no matter how heavy everything became. And over many weeks, those pebbles had gathered into a small, quiet cluster on the tabletop, something no one noticed except her. And always, when she had told him everything that weighed on her heart, Della would softly hum an old melody, the lullaby her mother had sung to her when she was little, the gentle notes she knew by heart so deeply that she didn't need to remember the words. She sang very softly, almost only loud enough for herself to hear, and that was one of the rare peaceful moments in the hardship of her life. What Della didn't know was that the man in the bed had not been sunk as deeply into unconsciousness as she believed. Wesley Calderon had awakened many nights before, and his mind was colder and sharper than ever, silently following every trace to find the person who had harmed him, the traitor still hiding somewhere inside this very house. He kept his body motionless like a block of stone, listening to every footstep, every voice that passed through the room, memorizing everything with the patience of a hunter. But in the world of suspicion and calculation, where he had imprisoned himself, there was only one thing that made him feel he still held on to some small part of his humanity. It was the voice of the girl who came to his side every night, that gentle storytelling voice and that murmured song, the sound that had become a fragile thread anchoring him in the dark. When people in this city mentioned the name Wesley Calderon, they usually lowered their voices, because he wasn't the kind of man anyone dared to name aloud in a crowded place. At 34, he was already standing at the peak of an underworld that most decent citizens had only heard about in scattered rumors, a world where power was measured by fear and loyalty was paid for with life itself. Across his hard, solid body were countless scars, each one a mark from a time when he had nearly lost everything and still managed to remain standing, and those very scars had taught him a lesson he had carved into his heart as deeply as if into stone, that trusting another person was the shortest road to death. And yet, beneath the cold ruthlessness that made the whole city fear him, Wesley still kept one unshakable principle for himself, one that every man under his command understood without needing it spoken aloud. He never tolerated the strong crushing those weaker than themselves. There had been a time, not long ago, in a warehouse under his control, when a large manager had grown used to punishing poor workers by withholding their wages and using violence against anyone who dared to speak up, until the day an old laborer, trembling all over, knelt before Wesley and begged for justice. Wesley didn't waste many words. He simply walked straight toward the arrogant manager, looked at him with eyes as dark as the warning before a storm, and with a few decisive, cold movements, brought that huge man crashing down onto the floor before he could even understand what was happening. Then Wesley ordered everything the man had stripped from him and drove him into exile, leaving the workers not only the wages they had been cheated out of, but also a lesson that under his roof, anyone who bullied the helpless would never have a place to hide. That was Wesley Calderon, a man in whom cruelty and integrity were mixed so closely together that they were almost impossible to separate. And it was that very man who now lay motionless on a bed, forcing himself to play the role of someone on the edge of death. He knew exactly what kind of poison had entered his body on that fateful night, something that slowed the heartbeat so severely that outsiders believed he had fallen into a deep coma. And he also knew that the person who had done it wasn't a stranger, but a hand from inside his own walls, a traitor blending in among the familiar faces that passed through the mansion every day. With the power in his hands, he could have awakened and hunted that person down to the end, but Wesley understood that if he acted too soon, he would only catch the hired hand while letting the true figure pulling the strings slip away. And then this would never truly end, because he suspected that the traitor in the house was only a pawn, that some outside force was patiently waiting for the day he stopped breathing in order to swallow whole everything he had built. Some shadow hiding out there beyond these walls, counting each day and hoping he would never rise again. That was why he chose to lie still, turning his outward helplessness into a trap, waiting patiently for the one in the dark to reveal himself, even though that meant surrendering his body every day to strange hands that cared for him, without being able to know which hands were sincere and which were waiting for the chance to finish him. The only person in the world who knew Wesley had awakened was Gideon Ash, the right-hand man who had followed him since the hardest days of his life, the man he trusted absolutely, and the only one who quietly helped him maintain the performance, gathering information outside in silence, and passing it back to him during those rare moments when no one else was in the room. Night after night, Wesley lay there with his mind drawn tight as a bowstring, calculating every move in his own deadly game of life and death, while quietly waiting for that familiar voice to rise beside his ear again when darkness fell. To understand why Della could grit her teeth and endure this harsh place for several months without once giving up, one had to look at what she went through every day under the hand of Mrs. Marlene and the older maids who gathered around her. From the very first week Della set foot in the mansion, she was placed at the very bottom, and the housekeeper didn't bother hiding her dislike for this newly arrived girl. The heaviest and dirtiest tasks were always piled onto her shoulders, from scrubbing the vast kitchens in the gray blur before dawn to carrying stacks of soaking wet towels, heavy with water, up and down several floors, while the senior servants only stood with their arms folded, pointing and ordering her about, then blaming her whenever something failed to please the mistress of the house. Worst of all was the matter of money, because every payday, Mrs. Marlene found all kinds of reasons to cut into Della's wages. Sometimes she claimed Della had broken a plate. Sometimes she said Della hadn't cleaned the floor properly, a little each time, until the small amount Della took home was hardly anything compared with the labor she had given. Della knew perfectly well those accusations had no basis, but she understood that arguing would only make everything worse, so she chose to stay silent and lower her head, swallowing all the hurt and injustice inside, because she didn't have the luxury of pride when, out there beyond these walls, there was still someone depending entirely on her. Every evening, after finishing all her duties, and before going up to room number 7 for the night shift, Della would slip out to the quiet corner of the yard behind the servants' quarters, the only place that offered even a little privacy, to call her little brother. Teddy was only 10 years old, living in the home of a kind neighbor across the city, and every time he heard his sister's voice over the telephone, he would cry out with joy, chattering brightly as he told her every sort of story from school, how his teacher had praised him that day, how he had received the highest score in the class on his math test, how he dreamed that one day he would get into a great school and become an engineer who built beautiful bridges. The boy's clear laughter rang through the line like a ray of sunlight piercing straight into Della's bleak days, and each time, she felt her heart grow warm again, felt all the hardship and humiliation of the day suddenly become smaller and easier to bear. She would often sit with her back against the brick wall that still held a little warmth from the day, smiling as she listened to him talk, now and then teasing him with a few words that made them both giggle, as though the distance between them had never existed. Della always told him to be good, to study hard, and she promised that as long as she could keep working, she would make sure he could go to a proper school, that she wouldn't let his dream be left unfinished because of poverty. The boy had no idea what his sister was suffering inside that luxurious mansion, and Della never let a word of it slip, because she wanted to keep his world clear and bright, wanted him to know only good things and the dreams waiting ahead of him. It was Teddy's small dream of bridges, that innocent laughter of his, that anchored Della whenever she felt she was about to collapse. It was the reason she bowed her head and endured Mrs. Marlene. It was the reason she kept staying awake through those long nights beside the sick man's bed, in exchange for that meager bit of money. She told herself she could endure everything, as long as her brother could grow up safely and have a brighter future. And that was exactly why the news of being unjustly dismissed struck her with such crushing force, because it didn't only take away her own livelihood. It threatened the very road she was struggling to open for the little brother she loved most in this world. During the long nights, he lay motionless, listening to everything happening around him. Wesley had gradually narrowed down the most suspicious people, and the first name that rose in his mind was none other than the housekeeper, Marlene Vosberg. He had reason to think so, because she was the one who held the power to arrange every schedule in the mansion, the one who decided who was allowed in and out of his room and at what hour, and the cold, calculating sharpness in her voice every time she passed room number 7 always stirred the predator's instinct inside him into caution. He heard the way she gave orders, the way she lowered her voice to whisper with those she trusted, the way she treated the lower servants with cruelty, and all of it painted in his mind the image of someone cold enough and ambitious enough to have a hand in a plot against her master. Wesley had almost placed his wager on that woman, memorizing each of her footsteps, each time she lingered beside his bed longer than usual, waiting for one careless opening to confirm what he suspected. Meanwhile, Della continued her night shifts without having any idea that a silent hunt was unfolding right beside her. One night, when she brought the medicine tray up to the room on schedule as usual, she happened to glance at the record book placed at the head of the bed, where every dose of medicine was carefully written down, and something made her pause. The number showing that night's dosage looked different from what her eyes had grown used to over the past several weeks, as though someone had changed it, shifting it just a little from the amount she knew by heart so well that she could have recited it with her eyes closed. Della picked up the tray and examined it, a vague uneasiness rising in her chest that she couldn't name, but then she comforted herself by thinking that perhaps the private doctor had adjusted the prescription, that such medical matters weren't the business of a maid like her, and that her duty was only to carry the tray upstairs and place it where it belonged, not to question numbers she had no right to interfere with. She pushed that uncomfortable feeling aside, set the tray down on the table, and never imagined that the tiny detail she had just glimpsed would be the first piece of a terrible truth slowly beginning to reveal itself. That night, after she had finished telling her usual story and was preparing to hum the familiar melody, Della suddenly startled when she saw the hand of the man on the bed move slightly, his fingers curling very faintly before relaxing again, a movement so small that if she hadn't been sitting close beside him, she would never have noticed it. Her heart pounded hard. She leaned closer, her eyes wide and fixed on his face, and for one moment, she thought she had seen his lashes tremble. Della held her breath, and her shaking voice rose in a whisper, asking whether he could hear her, whether all these nights he had truly heard the things she had told him. But the only answer she received was silence. His face returned to its old, cold stillness, not a single muscle moving, and Della began to doubt herself, wondering whether she had imagined it all because she was too exhausted. She couldn't know that in that very moment, Wesley was using every ounce of will he had to hold himself back, to keep from opening his eyes, because the genuine worry in her voice had just touched some place inside him that no one had reached in a very long time. He had almost exposed himself because of one moment of weakness, and that made him realize this girl was slowly becoming a variable he had never accounted for in his cold game, a fragile thread quietly pulling him toward the light while he was forced to keep hiding in the dark. Several nights after she had glimpsed the altered number in the record book, Della was assigned to go down to the basement to receive the medicine tray earlier than usual, and it was during that trip that she witnessed something whose full meaning she would only come to understand much later. Just as she stepped close to the door of the dispensary, she saw a man standing beside the table where the medicines were prepared. It was Conrad Vosberg, the younger brother of the housekeeper Marlene, the man known as the accountant, who handled the books for the entire mansion. Della was a little surprised, because Conrad belonged to the world of papers and money, and she rarely saw him coming and going in this area, but she didn't dare show curiosity. She only stood aside and waited. From where she stood, she saw him bend over the tray that had already been prepared, his hands moving quickly as he opened one of the small medicine bottles, poured out what was inside, and replaced it with something else he took from his coat pocket, his movements swift and practiced, as though he had done this many times before. Della blinked as she watched him, yet not the faintest suspicion stirred in her mind, because to her, this was simply someone connected to the housekeeper's family doing his work, perhaps adjusting the medicine according to the doctor's instructions, something entirely beyond the understanding and authority of a maid like her. She lowered her head politely when Conrad looked up and caught her gaze, then obediently accepted the tray he pushed toward her, carried it up to room number 7 without a single worry in her heart, completely unaware that she had just seen with her own eyes the hand of the person behind everything. Upstairs, in that room, Wesley was still absorbed in his silent search, and that night, through the fragments of information Gideon secretly passed to him, together with what Wesley himself had heard with his own ears, the picture in his mind finally became clear. It turned out he had been wrong to place all his suspicion on Mrs. Marlene, because although that woman was indeed cruel and full of calculation, her cruelty stopped at petty schemes meant to strengthen her authority inside the mansion. It wasn't enough to build a plot to poison her master. The one truly involved, the one who had quietly exchanged his medicines little by little, was Conrad himself, the younger brother who had seemed harmless, spending his days with nothing but numbers and ledgers. Wesley clenched his teeth in the darkness as the truth came to light, blaming himself for nearly being fooled by that man's gentle disguise. And he understood that he had to be even more patient now, because if Conrad was only the one carrying out orders, then the person behind him was the real prey Wesley was waiting for. Yet amid all those cold calculations, there was one thing Wesley had become completely certain of in his heart, and that was that the girl who still came to his side every night had absolutely nothing to do with this plot. He had listened to her through long, endless weeks, had heard her tell stories no one would invent before someone she believed was on the edge of death, stories in which she honestly confessed even the things that left her at a disadvantage, her fears, her weaknesses, the moments when her own sorrow nearly made her cry. No schemer would spend so much effort performing such a long play before a motionless body that couldn't testify for them. No one would bare their heart so honestly, so nakedly, if they were still hiding some calculation inside. That sincerity, untouched by pretense, revealed night after night in the innocent belief that no one could hear her, had become the strongest proof of her innocence in the eyes of a man who had grown used to seeing lies and betrayal everywhere he looked. And the more certain Wesley became of her innocence, the heavier his heart felt, because he knew that this honest girl was unknowingly being pulled into a dangerous whirlpool, and that every night, her clean hands were still carrying up to him the very thing his enemy was using to take his life. That fateful day began like any other, until Mrs. Marlene summoned Della to meet privately in her office, with a thin smile on her lips whose meaning the young woman couldn't possibly guess. On the desk before her lay a sparkling necklace, the costly jewel of an honored guest who had stayed at the mansion a few days earlier, and beside it was the old cloth bag Della always used to hold a few small belongings of her own. Mrs. Marlene slowly said that the necklace had been found hidden inside Della's own bag, that everything was already perfectly clear, and that a thief like her no longer had any right to remain in this place for even one more day. Della froze where she stood. She stammered that she had never seen that necklace before, had never set foot in the guest's room, that someone must have deliberately placed it in her bag to frame her, but the more she spoke, the wider the housekeeper's smile stretched, full of triumph. Della understood at once that this was a carefully laid trap, that her bag had been left in the servants' quarters where anyone could have touched it, and that Mrs. Marlene had chosen her as the scapegoat for some purpose she still couldn't understand. But what stunned her most wasn't the accusation. It was what the woman calmly said next. Mrs. Marlene mentioned little Teddy, mentioned the precious scholarship her brother had just earned because of his excellent grades, the scholarship that was the entire future Della had been building for him day and night. In a honeyed voice, the woman said that the world was smaller than people thought, that those with power and broad connections like her family could easily influence the review board and make them withdraw that scholarship with only a few slanderous words about the character of the sister raising the boy, a sister branded as a thief. She suggested that if Della obediently lowered her head, confessed, quietly signed the paper admitting she had stolen the necklace, then left in silence without a single complaint, everything would end there, and her little brother's future would remain safe. But if Della stubbornly kept insisting she was innocent and made a scene of it, then Mrs. Marlene wouldn't hesitate to turn both their lives into chaos, and the boy's dream of going to school would vanish like smoke before it even had a chance to begin. As Della listened, she felt as though the ground had collapsed beneath her feet. Her hands shook violently, and her throat tightened with bitterness until she couldn't speak. She could endure every injustice that fell upon her own head, could swallow the shame of being falsely accused, could walk away with nothing and not utter one word of complaint, but she couldn't trade away the future of her little brother, the future she had sacrificed everything to protect. The image of Teddy's bright face whenever he talked about his dream of attending a great school rose in her mind, and that image squeezed her heart until she could barely breathe, driving her into a dead end with no way out. Mrs. Marlene knew very well what weakness she held in her hand over this girl, knew that as long as she touched the boy, Della would have no choice but to yield, and she savored that power with a calm so cruel it was almost unbearable. Leaving the office with the unsigned confession still clutched in her hand, Della dragged herself forward step by heavy step like someone who had lost her soul, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. She knew she would have to leave in the morning, knew that to protect her brother's dream, she would have to grit her teeth and accept a crime she hadn't committed, and it was in that deepest despair that she decided tonight, the last night she would still remain in this place. She would go up to room number 7 to say goodbye to the silent man who had become her only emotional support through all these months. The song had just faded from her lips when a low, hoarse voice suddenly sounded in the silent room, a voice rough from not having spoken for far too long, yet still carrying an authority that couldn't be mistaken, saying that she sang far better than she thought. Della jolted violently, her entire body going rigid in the chair, her eyes widening in terror as she stared toward the bed where the man had lain motionless for so many weeks. Wesley Calderon was looking at her with his eyes open, those dark eyes now awake and sharp enough to send a chill through her, without a single trace left of the dying man she had believed him to be. For one moment, Della thought she must be delirious. She clapped a hand over her mouth to stop the cry that nearly escaped, pushing the chair backward as her heart pounded so wildly that she could hear the rush of blood in her temples. She stammered without forming a proper sentence, looking from him to the room around them as if searching for some explanation for the unbelievable sight unfolding before her eyes, her trembling mouth asking, since when, asking whether he had only just awakened. Wesley slowly shifted, leaning his back against the headboard, each movement still carrying a little difficulty after the long days of pretending to be still, and he told her in a terrifyingly calm voice that he had awakened many nights ago, that throughout all that time, he had heard everything. Della went utterly still as those words sank into her mind, and a fresh wave of panic rushed over her when she began to search her memory for everything she had poured out in this room, all her most private secrets, her tears, her grievances, the personal stories she had believed only the 4 walls and an unknowing body had witnessed. Her face flushed red, then went pale again. She stammered an apology for having disturbed him all this time, for having recklessly poured meaningless stories into the ears of a man like him, and she hurriedly stood, ready to flee the room in the deepest shame and fear. But Wesley called her back, his voice not loud, yet carrying a force that seemed to pin her feet to the floor. He said she didn't need to apologize for anything, that through those long, dark nights, her voice and the stories she told had been the only things that made him feel he was still alive, the sound that pulled him out of the empty void he had thought he might never escape. Della turned back to look at him, her eyes still wet with tears and filled with disbelief, unable to understand why a powerful, distant man like him could say such words to a lowly maid like her. Then, as though suddenly remembering her bitter situation, she lowered her head and murmured that, in any case, she would have to leave in the morning, that this was the last night she was allowed to step into this room, and that she had only wanted to say goodbye to him before she went. Wesley frowned, his gaze sharpening for an instant, and he asked why she had to leave. Della hesitated for a long while, then finally told him about the accusation of theft, about the trap she was certain someone had laid for her, though she didn't dare say outright who it was. After hearing it, Wesley's face showed no emotion at all, but deep in his eyes, a cold light had flared to life. the light of a man far too accustomed to seeing through dark schemes. He was silent for a moment, then spoke, each word slow and firm like an undeniable declaration, saying that she wasn't going anywhere, that from this moment on, no one would be able to drive her out of this house anymore. Della stared at him in confusion, not yet able to understand the full meaning of those words, her heart stirred by a fragile thread of hope, and at the same time flooded with bewilderment before this mysterious man she had thought she understood, only to realize she had never truly known him at all. While Della was still stunned by Wesley's words, in another corner of the mansion, Conrad Vosberg was growing increasingly restless under the weight of a fear that kept swelling inside him. He had quietly asked questions and pieced everything together, and he realized that the young maid was the very person who had been present in the dispensary on the night he switched the medicine, that she might very well have seen what she was never supposed to see. To a man already involved in a plot to harm his master, even an accidental witness was a threat that couldn't be left alone, and he decided he had to act before the girl realized the importance of what she had witnessed. That night, when Della left room number 7 and went downstairs to fetch more clean towels as usual, Conrad stopped her in the deserted stretch of corridor leading down to the basement, where the light was dim and not a single person passed by. At first, his voice was still falsely sweet, as he asked whether she had noticed anything unusual over the past few days. But when he saw confusion appear on her face, his expression changed at once, and he forced her back against the wall at the end of the corridor with eyes full of threat. Terrified, Della kept backing away until her back touched the ice-cold wall, and she realized she had been cornered with no way out. Her heart pounded as she read the dangerous intent in the eyes of the man moving closer. She opened her mouth to cry for help, but Conrad reached out, ready to cover it, hissing warnings that she had better keep her mouth shut forever if she didn't want both herself and her brother to suffer the consequences. Just when Della thought there was no way left for her to escape, an icy voice sounded from the end of the corridor, the same voice that, not long ago, Conrad had still firmly believed belonged to a man lying there faintly breathing and waiting to die. Conrad spun around and went rigid with horror when he saw Wesley Calderon standing there, leaning one shoulder against the doorframe, his face still pale after those long days confined to bed, but his eyes burning with the cold authority of a ruler who had just returned from death. For the first time in so many weeks, Wesley had left that bed on his own. His steps toward them were still slow, but steady and heavy with pressure, each one seeming to tighten the circle around the trembling traitor. Conrad stammered without managing a word, his face turning ashen with terror. He released Della and staggered backward, but it was already too late. Wesley didn't need to raise a hand. With a single cold nod from his master, Gideon stepped forward with movements decisive and chillingly precise, stripping the large man of any ability to resist and forcing him to the floor. The sheer, terrifying authority in Wesley's gaze proved that the underworld leader had returned, his power absolute despite his weakened body. Answering his master's silent command, Gideon then quickly dragged the subdued traitor away into the darkness, leaving only Wesley and Della standing face to face in the stillness that had just settled again. Della trembled with her back against the wall, her legs nearly giving way from fear and from the shock of everything that had just happened. And when she looked up at the man who had saved her, a strange feeling rose in her heart. Through all those nights, she had been the one caring for him, the one sitting by his bed to keep watch, wiping him with a towel, singing to him when he lay there weak and unable to protect himself. Yet now everything had been completely reversed. The man who had once lain motionless beneath her careful hands was the one who had just stepped forward to shield her in the most dangerous moment. Wesley came closer, reached out to steady her trembling arm, and in a deep voice that had softened a little, asked whether she was all right, a simple question that brought tears to the edge of Della's eyes, because it had been so long since anyone had truly worried about her safety that way. After Conrad was subdued and taken away, Gideon spent the entire night questioning him, and by near dawn, what the man confessed had confirmed exactly what Wesley had long suspected, that this accountant was nothing more than a pawn, a hired tool carrying out orders, not the true mastermind, the one pulling the strings behind everything, the one who had been patiently waiting for the day Wesley stopped breathing so she could swallow up everything he had built, was Damaris Holloway, a powerful figure in the underworld who had long hungered for the rich territory Wesley controlled. Damaris wasn't the kind of person who favored direct confrontation. She was the kind who preferred to move in darkness, using money and promises to buy people's hearts. And this time, she had struck directly at Conrad's weakness. A man who had nursed years of resentment because he believed his work managing the books had never been valued by Wesley as much as it deserved. With only a few secret meetings and a large enough promise of power after Wesley was gone, Damaris had turned the seemingly harmless accountant into a dagger buried in his master's back, quietly poisoning him little by little so that death would come naturally, without anyone suspecting a thing. When Wesley heard Gideon recount the whole truth, he only gave a faint nod. There was no surprise in his heart, because every piece had now fallen into place, exactly matching the instinct he had held onto through all those nights, lying still and waiting, the instinct that there was a force outside these walls. He understood that if he revealed himself now and moved against Damaris too quickly, she could deny all connection, push every crime onto Conrad, then slip back into the shadows and wait for another chance, because someone as seasoned as Damaris surely hadn't left behind any direct trace linking her to the plot. To pull the weed up by the roots, Wesley needed a trap clever enough to force Damaris herself to step into the light and admit her crime before watching eyes. And to build that trap, he needed two things. First, he had to keep the fact that he had awakened a secret, so Damaris and her people would still believe their plan was going smoothly, and that he was still lying there, barely breathing, waiting to die. Second, and most importantly, he needed Della's testimony, because she was the only one who had seen Conrad switching the medicine with her own eyes. And the statement of an innocent witness with no ties to the underworld would be the strongest proof to expose the entire plot. Wesley summoned Della, and this time he hid nothing from her. He told her the truth about being poisoned, about Conrad's role, and about the dark shadow named Damaris standing behind it all. Della listened in shock. She hadn't imagined that the splendid mansion where she worked could be hiding such a dark conspiracy, and she was even more stunned when she realized that the night she had accidentally seen Conrad beside the medicine tray carried such a terrible meaning. Wesley looked straight into her eyes and said he needed her help, that only her truthful testimony could expose the person who had woven the net meant to take his life and drive her into misery. He also said he understood this was dangerous, that he had no right to force her into a danger that didn't belong to her, but he promised he would protect her and her little brother at any cost. Della remained silent for a long time, her heart tangled between fear and a new feeling slowly beginning to kindle inside her. But then she thought of all the injustice she had endured, thought of the man who had stepped forward to save her in her most dangerous moment, and she lifted her head and gave a slight nod, agreeing to become the final link in the trap Wesley was about to lay in order to reclaim justice for both of them. Wesley's plan was built with meticulous care down to the smallest detail, and the first link in it was to make Damaris believe her prey was still within her grasp. After being subdued, Conrad was forced to cooperate in the hope of receiving leniency. He sent word to Damaris that everything was still moving according to plan, that Wesley had grown so weak he was barely breathing his last faint breaths, and at the same time suggested that this was the right moment for her to come to the mansion in person, to witness the ending she had been waiting for so long, as well as to arrange the takeover. Damaris was a cautious woman, but greed and the arrogance of a victory she believed was already firmly in her hands made her agree, and that was the fatal mistake Wesley had foreseen. That night, Damaris entered room number 7, with the triumphant bearing of someone arriving to harvest the fruit of her labor. Her gaze swept over the motionless body on the bed with undisguised satisfaction, and she began speaking with smug pride about how long she had patiently waited for this moment, about how Wesley's entire empire would soon belong to her. Della, exactly as arranged, stood tucked away in the corner of the room, in the role of a maid finishing her night duties, and it was her seemingly harmless presence that made Damaris drop her guard completely, letting every confession about her scheme spill freely from her mouth. But that young woman didn't merely stand there like a silent shadow, because when the decisive moment came, it was Della who stepped forward, her voice trembling yet clear and firm, and exposed that she had seen Conrad switch the medicine with her own eyes on that fateful night, that she was ready to testify to everything she knew. Her words cut through Damaris's arrogance like a blade, and at the very moment the woman froze in shock, the man on the bed slowly opened his eyes and sat up, alive and full of authority, the complete opposite of the dying shell she had expected to see. Damaris's face changed color. She stammered and backed away when she realized she had walked straight into a trap laid out in advance, that every smug word she had just spoken had reached not only Wesley's ears, but also the ears of his loyal men, who were quietly guarding every exit. Wesley rose from the bed and advanced toward her step by step, with the presence of a king returning to his throne. and he said in a voice as cold as ice that she had made the greatest mistake of her life when she thought she could bring him down with cowardly tricks carried out in the dark. Damaris tried to struggle, tried to give orders to the men she had brought with her, but Gideon and Wesley's people had already subdued them before they even had the chance to react, and in only a moment, all of her forces had been neatly restrained, with no ability left to resist. Wesley didn't need bloody, brutal acts to prove his power, because his absolute domination and the way he had overturned the entire game were already the heaviest punishment dealt to the one who had dared betray him. Every path of retreat for Damaris had been sealed. Every calculation of hers had turned to ash right before her eyes. She was escorted away along with Conrad to face the price for what she had done, and when their figures had disappeared completely, room number 7 became strangely still. Della stood there, her whole body still trembling after those breathless moments of tension. But in her eyes now there wasn't only fear. There was something else shining there. The quiet pride of someone who had dared to stand upright before evil and help reclaim justice. Wesley turned to look at her, and for the first time since he had awakened, a rare gentleness flickered across his cold face, because he understood that without the courage of this small young woman, his perfect trap could never have closed so completely. When everything had settled, and the truth had been fully brought into the open, Della slowly began to understand the full meaning of what she had unknowingly taken part in through all those weeks, and that realization came over her like an icy wave, drowning out every small joy that had only just begun to rise. She suddenly understood that the trays she had carried day and night to place beside his bed, the doses of medicine she had obediently brought without the slightest suspicion, were the very things that had been eating away at this man's life, bit by bit. Her own hands, the hands she had always believed knew only how to care and soothe, had been the hands that delivered to his very mouth the thing his enemies were using to kill him. And even though she had known nothing, even though she was only an innocent pawn being used, that thought still strangled her heart until she could hardly breathe. Della stepped back several paces, clutching both hands tightly to her chest, her face turning pale as tears began to fall without any way to stop them. Through her sobs, she stammered that all this time it had been her who had harmed him, that if anything had happened to him, she would never have been able to forgive herself. She collapsed under the weight of absolute guilt, a feeling more terrible than every injustice and humiliation she had ever endured, because this time, what she feared she had damaged wasn't herself, but the only person in this place who had treated her with kindness. She cried helplessly, repeating her apology again and again, as though by doing so, she could wash away a sin she had never truly meant to commit. Wesley stepped closer, and instead of the familiar cold words, he lowered himself to one knee before her and gently took her trembling hands into his own. He told her in a deep, warm voice she had never heard from him before that none of this was her fault, that she too had been used as a victim just as he had been, that the only ones who had to bear the guilt were those who had cruelly created that vicious plot, not the honest girl who hadn't known anything at all. Then he went on, each word pouring straight into her breaking heart, telling her that she was seeing everything the wrong way, because through those long, dark nights, she hadn't been the one who harmed him. On the contrary, she was the one who had kept him alive. He told her that during the time he had been forced to imprison himself in darkness, alone and filled with suspicion, when every breath was a battle and his trust in people had run dry, it was her voice sounding beside him each night. The sincere stories she told, the gentle songs she hummed, that had been the only thread holding him to life. He said there had been nights when he thought he no longer wanted to keep fighting, when that darkness had nearly swallowed him whole. But then she would come again, sit down beside him, and begin to speak, and it was that warmth that reminded him there were still things in the world worth living for. He softly tightened his hold on her hands, and said that if debts and grievances had to be weighed, then she had saved him 10,000 times more than whatever harm others had used her to cause, and that debt of grace was one he would spend the rest of his life repaying. Della looked up at him through her tears, and in that moment, the weight of guilt crushing her was suddenly lifted away, replaced by a warmth and tenderness she had never known before, the feeling of being fully understood for the first time in her life, and valued for exactly what she was truly worth. The next morning, Wesley summoned every servant in the mansion down to the grand hall, and the news that the master they had believed to be dying was now fully awake, and standing tall in the middle of the hall left everyone present frozen in stunned disbelief. Mrs. Marlene Vosberg stood among the crowd with a bloodless face. because she understood all too well that the return of the master meant every scheme of hers was about to be dragged into the light. Wesley didn't rush to accuse anyone. He slowly swept his gaze across the bowed faces before him, then ordered Della to step forward and stand beside him. To the astonishment of everyone who had only ever seen her as a lowly maid branded as a thief. Mrs. Marlene tried to salvage what little dignity she had left, speaking up to repeat the accusation that this girl was the one who had stolen the treasured jewelry of an honored guest, and that someone like her wasn't worthy of standing beside the master. But Wesley only lifted the corner of his mouth slightly, and instead of answering with words, he slowly took a carefully wrapped handkerchief from his coat pocket, then opened it with deliberate calm on the large table in the middle of the hall before everyone's eyes. Inside that handkerchief was a handful of small pebbles, in all kinds of shapes and colors, ordinary-looking stones that he had quietly collected and kept through all those weeks, from the little table beside his bed. The entire hall sank into confused silence. None of the servants understood the meaning of those strange pebbles, except for one person. Della stood completely still when she saw them, her eyes widening and her lips trembling, because only she knew what each pebble lying there carried with it. Only she understood that this man had silently kept every tiny trace she had left behind during the loneliest nights of her life. Tears quietly spilled from her eyes, not from hurt as they had before, but from an emotion too deep to put into words, as she realized that throughout the time she had believed she was speaking to an unfeeling wall, someone had not only listened to every word she said, but had also cherished and preserved even the things she'd never imagined he noticed. Wesley spoke, his voice echoing through the grand hall. He said that through all the long nights he had lain there, he had heard everything and witnessed everything, and he knew clearly who was innocent and who had fabricated lies to frame someone who had done no wrong. He declared in a firm voice that Della Hartwell had never been a thief, that she was the kindest and most honest person he had ever met beneath this roof, and that the people standing here were the ones who needed to answer for their sins. His eyes turned toward Mrs. Marlene, cold and filled with authority, and he exposed everything she had done, from cutting wages and tormenting those beneath her, to conspiring to stage a false accusation that drove an innocent girl into a corner. Mrs. Marlene was left speechless, every denial useless before the evidence and truth the master already held in his hands, and she and her accomplices were immediately stripped of every position and driven out of the mansion, forced to face the fitting price for what they had done. Wesley also had someone contact the Scholarship Review Board at once, to make sure little Teddy's future wouldn't be affected in any way by those poisonous slanders, that the boy's dream of going to school would remain whole and wide open, exactly as it should be. When Della heard that, she couldn't hold herself back anymore and broke into sobs. But these were tears of overwhelming happiness, because the thing she had feared most, the thing she had been willing to accept a false guilt to protect, had now been preserved completely. She turned to look at Wesley, the man who had once been a stranger lying motionless beneath her careful hands, the man to whom she had emptied her heart in the belief that no one could hear her, and now he was the very person who had stood forward to return to her not only her innocence, but also her dignity and her faith in life. In that moment, in the middle of the grand hall under the eyes of everyone, Della understood that her life had turned onto an entirely new page. A few weeks later, when every storm had passed and the Calderon mansion had returned to its old peace, Della stood in the sun-filled front courtyard, her heart fluttering as she waited for a reunion she had longed for through so many months of separation. When the car stopped and the door opened, little Teddy rushed out and ran straight into his sister's arms, laughing as he called her name over and over, and Della wrapped him tightly against her, holding that small body close, as though she never wanted to let him go again. The boy chattered brightly, telling her every sort of story, proudly saying that he was still at the top of his class in math, that his teacher said he had real talent, that he had already begun drawing his first bridge designs in his little notebook, and his clear laughter rang through the sunlit courtyard, warming Della's heart until it nearly brought her to tears. Now the two siblings had a real home to lean on. Teddy could attend the school he had always dreamed of, and Della no longer had to lower her head and endure injustice and humiliation, because Wesley had arranged a proper job for her and treated her with the respect she deserved. On one quiet afternoon, Della led her brother to a small, peaceful garden, where she placed a pure white bouquet in memory of their late mother, the woman who had passed away in loneliness years ago and had become the beginning of the storytelling habit that changed Della's entire life. In her heart, she softly told her mother that those days of hardship had finally passed, that she and Teddy were safe now, and that she believed her mother, somewhere beyond this world, was still listening to her, just as Della had always believed someone would listen. Standing quietly at a distance and witnessing that moment, Wesley understood that the small young woman, once rejected by the whole world, carried within her a strength his power and money could never buy, the strength of a sincere heart that never stopped being kind, even when life had treated her with the greatest injustice. Della's story reminds us that a person's dignity has never been decided by status or wealth, that kindness and sincerity, no matter how small they may seem, can create miracles we never expect, and that the voice of someone weak, when it rises from an honest heart, still has the power to touch and move even souls that seem frozen shut. Sometimes, the most precious thing we can give one another in this life isn't anything grand or material, but simply the act of listening, the choice not to let anyone be alone in their darkest hours. If Della's story touched your heart, please leave a like, so we'll know you're still listening. Don't forget to share this video with those who need a warm story today. And please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next deeply emotional stories. How do you feel about this story? Was there any moment that brought tears to your eyes or left something lingering in your heart? Please leave a comment and share your feelings from deep within your heart, so we can listen and share them with you. May everyone watching this video always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace of mind, and calm in every passing day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.